Welcome to this June gathering of Beneath the Wisteria. As I said, we usually meet in the Maud Street, Melbourne. Because of COVID, we've been meeting on Zoom, which has turned out to be a good thing because we really interesting people like Bonnie turn up and talk to us, and she wouldn't make the trip from Newcastle to Shepparton for 1 hour, just informal chat with us. So it's been pretty handy. This meeting is being hosted from the lands of the Yorta people and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land. Also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I want to acknowledge other elders from other communities who may be with us today. And we should note that this land has never been ceded. Our special guest today is Bonnie McBain, who on my screen is up. Oh, there's somebody else. On my screen is up in the top left-hand corner. So I'm not sure where she's on yours. Bonnie is a senior lecturer from the University of Newcastle. She's with the School of Environmental and Life Sciences at the university. She advocates for a more holistic approach to the examination of change, environment, change-resistant issues, building community and modelling solutions. She has a multidisciplinary approach to environmental science, based expertise in ecological footprints, climate change, surface water quality, catchment management, sustainable forest management, air quality, groundwater, and fisheries management. And I did promise it, and I talked to Bonnie about this, that she would explain the difference between complexity and complex. There are problems. So welcome to you, Bonnie. If you can talk for 15 minutes or so, that'd be great. And I've got a big note here for myself to record, so I'm doing that. So over to you, Bonnie.
Oh, thanks, Robert. And thanks very much for having me, everyone. I don't have a particularly formal presentation today. I just wanted to share maybe some of the research that we've been doing. I note that there's an interest in climate change in the group, so we can talk a little bit about some of the renewables work I've been involved in. It is a little bit dated, but as far as I'm concerned, the fact that it's dated is an exciting thing because things are changing very fast. So we can talk about that. There are still some really common threads that are really important to talk about despite all that change. And that's an ongoing challenge for us. So we can talk about how we can be effective in that sphere. And I'm also very happy, and maybe I'll start off by talking about what is the difference between complicated and complex, because complexity is something that's relatively new. It's a growing type of problem because of the changes that are happening in the world at the moment. So the rate of change is increasing, the interconnectivity across the globe is increasing, and the value of this word truth or fact is becoming more fluid. So all of these things, these types of things, are resulting in the fact that we now have this world that is growing increasingly complex. And what's emerging from that is a type of problem called a complex, or otherwise known as a wicked problem. And wicked problems are probably what you've heard more about in the media if you've heard about these problems. They've been researched in universities such as my own for quite a long time. So there's decades of research. I think the original concept is decades old. But in terms of practice, it's very rare to see the practice of complex problem management happen in the real world. And this is where I see things are now slowly starting to change. So it's very encouraging, but it is slow. And I think one of the problems is that we don't, generally, we can't recognize a complex problem when we see one. We just get frustrated by trying to fix something and things continuing to fail. So complex problems are very typically, they've got some very typical characteristics. One of the most obvious is that you will have multiple stakeholders involved in managing that problem or affected by that problem that see the problem in a completely different way. And the Murray-Darling Basin, just because we've had that come up in conversation this morning already before the session started officially, is a really lovely example, because you will have completely different opinions from farmers, from government people trying to regulate that water source, from environmental groups to Indigenous landholders, and those differences in understanding what the problems are mean that it's impossible to come up with a single definition of the problem. And that sounds academically annoying, but in practicality, if we're not talking about the same problem, then it means that there are hugely divergent responses that people think should happen to that problem. And thereby we get these high levels of conflict that seem to not be able to be resolved. And that complexity is difficult, because if we don't recognize the underlying characteristics of that problem, and we don't deal with that particular issue, then what we get is the typical sort of thing that we see with complex problems, is that they are so highly resistant to all the things that we're throwing at them. And so we see that with climate change. It's like the big complex problem of all complex problems. We see that with managing obesity. Australia is a classic example. If obesity were, logically, obesity is a fairly simple concept. Like, we have energy in and then energy used and energy out, or energy conserved. And it's, from a scientific point of view, that's a very simple concept. And you would think that would be easy to manage. Once you get into the complexity of obesity management, you realize it's very much about access to information, access to fresh fruit and vegetables, access to green space. And that has all these social implications about what your socioeconomic status is, where you're located, city or regions. So there are these multiple interconnected different elements of the problem. And one of the other characteristics of complex problems is that you will have lots of individual groups working on a problem, but they won't recognize that interconnectivity, or they won't understand that. And if they don't understand how their work is connected with maybe a department or a group in a completely different area, then they may be inadvertently working against each other. So even though their intent is really clear and virtuous, they may actually be part of the problem. And that's a really common part of complex problem management. And all of those little characteristics, the fact that the rates of change are so quick, the fact that sometimes this level of interconnectivity means we get really unpredictable outcomes from things that we do. Sometimes the discord means that we don't have open communication lines, and the problem persists internally, and we blame certain really obvious things, but we don't actually work on the underlying things that we need to work on. So complex problems are difficult to manage, and once you start seeing the different elements of complexity, there's a little bit of a relief that, okay, I understand why this is complex and why it's not changing. So that's great, but it's also quite overwhelming for people, because if everything we're doing doesn't work, then now what? And the good news is that there are some examples and methodologies that you can use to work on complex problems, but what they do require is sustained resourcing, sustained collaboration, and sustained time. And hereby is our dilemma, because in our world, everything is fast and furious and short attention span, surface conversations. And really, all of those types of conditions are an antithesis to what we need to solve complex problems. So my experience of solving complex problems is to set up longer-term collaborative conversations and relationship building that allows people from very different backgrounds to start having very genuine conversations with each other and with themselves about how their actions may be implicated in the management of a complex issue. And once you have that time and that ability to build relationships and trust between people, it's only at that point that you have the ability to start rearranging in your own mind how you see the world. And this is the critical part for complex problems. We all have our individual ways of understanding why a particular problem is a problem and how we should fix it. And that is influenced by our worldview. And that worldview is something that's influenced by our whole past life and its influences. So our family, our friends, our the newspaper that we read or don't read, what we see on Facebook or Twitter, all of those things, our cultural background. And it's not until we're willing to let go of some of that worldview and open up to new possibilities that we can be more embracing. And the way I think about it is, if reality is represented by a jigsaw puzzle with lots of pieces, then each of us that are involved in a particular problem, we hold a certain subset of the jigsaw puzzle pieces, but we can never hold the full reality. We can never own every jigsaw puzzle piece for the whole jigsaw. So our worldview is limited in that we see certain aspects of the problem. And the idea between when you're working on a complex problem, and the name for that type of work is transdisciplinary, and I'll talk about that in a little while. The idea behind that methodology and behind collaborating with people that you don't agree with is that your conversations over time incrementally collect more puzzle pieces to allow you to see a bigger part of the problem. And that's really, it requires you to confront the way you understand the world. And that's really quite difficult to do because you've got to change how you think foundationally, and let go maybe sometimes of the way you see the world and incorporate how other people see the world a lot more. And so that type of conversation requires fairly high levels of trust between the people who are engaging in those conversations. And that's the sort of climate that you need as a facilitator of managing complex problems. You need to be able to initiate that type of climate in the group that you're working with, so that people can be brave enough to go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. I now understand this situation differently. And if you get multiple people doing that collectively, then transdisciplinary work allows you as a collective group to maybe define the problem in a completely new way. And that is somewhat shared. You might not get every part of that problem definition shared, but you will have the potential to share more puzzle pieces across one another. And that's the aim of transdisciplinary work. And that's the foundation on which you can then come up with new solutions to problems, because you're seeing the problem in a completely different way. And that's what we want for dealing with complex problems. Admittedly, that's very difficult to do in a highly contested environment. So the current politics that we see in Australia at the moment is not conducive to dealing with those complex problems in that way. So the hope is that you do that at a smaller scale, in smaller contexts, to be able to do pilot work to show that it's possible. And then hopefully an experience of having done that can then be moved elsewhere. And that's the slow trajectory that people like myself are now starting on, trying to get this becoming a more common practice by having people involved at a smaller scale, seeing how it works, and then moving that elsewhere into other environments. So I don't know if that's helpful or if it's clarified anything or just made you all more confused. So I'm very happy to answer any questions. I think that's probably best to do that now rather than waiting for too long. Or if you've got anything else you'd like me to talk about, I'm very happy to do that too.
Bonnie, when I interviewed you earlier, you mentioned climate change was the big doozy of problems. Why do you say that?
Robert, it's because we have the degree to which, first of all, humanity is at risk. So it's the urgency of that problem, which is probably one of the most urgent problems that we're facing. So that, for instance, is probably the main driver. It's also that it's got those classic interconnectedness across the globe. One of the really interesting parts about complex problems is that they may not just be caused by one big event, but their accumulation of little, and that accumulation incrementally over time is something that often goes underneath the radar, and climate change is a classic example of that, but it's not atypical for complex problems. So yes, carbon emissions have been happening since time immemorial, and they've been escalating from a human perspective since the Industrial Revolution, but that change hasn't happened instantly at one point in time. So for us humans, psychologically, that's a very difficult thing to deal with, because we respond to big things that face us at one moment in time, and we tend to ignore the smaller things as the classic frog in the boiling water type psychology. So that's one of the difficult things with climate change, is that each of us have contributed to climate change in small incremental ways. But every time we do something that contributes to climate change, we're like, oh, it's only little. I'll just go around the corner and drive my car and pick up the paper. And from that perspective, that's completely justifiable. But when you think about every person making decisions like that cumulatively over time, that's very difficult to manage. So what we need is both a response on the ground with the minions, with us, and we need the high-level responses, and we need that across all of that scale. So it's very difficult to coordinate that. Obviously, with climate change, you very typically see lots of different people understanding the problem in very different ways and having different solutions to it. And the contestation over that is also very typical. So yeah, climate change is the big doozy for a number of reasons. Really, it's not, you would think climate change would be, okay, the scientists have told us this, they've been measuring it for X years, they've got all the results in, now it's just a matter of changing policy. But as is typical with your complex problems, that's not that straightforward. It's much more about lobby groups undermining the scientific information, making sure there's not a political mandate for that, and a lot of confusing messages for people like ourselves on the ground that mean there's not the political will to demand change.
I'm interested, and I agree that agreeing on the problem is probably the key to getting through these issues. Bonnie, I was wondering if you had any experience or examples of where you've seen this work well and the process that was used.
Yeah, so most recently, John, I was involved in a project to develop standards for environmental education. And this doesn't sound like a very complex situation, but believe you me, it's got all the classic signs of complexity. So a huge range of different stakeholders, all understanding environmental education in a very different way. Each of them feeling like they have a potential range of solutions, but also having a number of those, but no real measure of saying one is better than the other. And so what a colleague of mine from the university did was organise a whole lot of collaborative workshops with stakeholders from all around Australia. And as well as doing that, we set up a number of working groups And we considered those working groups, we were the people that had that sustained experience over that whole entire project. So the workshops around Australia, I didn't consider them transdisciplinary, but they were the information that fed into the group that had a sustained relationship over that time period. And we were able to, and we made sure that our group was very diverse, that we didn't represent just one stakeholder group. This is really important in sustainability or in transdisciplinary work, is that you don't just go and play with the people that you like. You play with the people that disagree with you. And you bring those people into the process as partners at an equal level. So the transdisciplinary experience for us was that we changed quite radically how we thought about environmental education, as well as at the same time being able to bring in our expertise from very different areas to be able to understand that problem in a different way. And it was not until then that we could actually then constructively make decisions about what we should do about that. So what should the standards look like? So it's a very small example. It's not like me going off and solving climate change. But I'm just having a quick look at my my bookshelf. I think I might have left the book at my office, so I haven't got it here, but there's a guy called Strauss, S-T-R-O-H, who has written a really fascinating book on working on social complex problems through exactly this process. And he describes it really beautifully. So what I'll do is I'll send the details of the book to Robert when I've got the chance, so that I can share it with you as well. It's really easily written, and he talks about particular case studies. There's one particular case study of prison recidivism in the US, and they worked across stakeholder groups to reduce that over time. And it was a really fascinating case study for me because I hadn't thought about that as a complex problem. It's outside of my field. But at the same time, it had all the classic signs of all the things that I dealt with in my experiences as well. So, yeah, I think the idea with transdisciplinary work is don't just play with your friends, invite your enemies in, and deliberately set up an environment where the different perspectives are valued, and there is a safe space to be able to develop relationships despite disagreement. And that's probably a really tricky facilitation process that requires a really skilled facilitator if you're dealing with a situation that's highly volatile, especially. But the methodologies are an investment in those relationships, so that even if people don't absolutely agree, they have that space to be able to find some common ground. And they have the time to be able to do that, because you can't just take one worldview out of your brain and pop in another one. It's actually, there's a process which we theoretically call transformative learning when we're talking about teaching and learning at the university. And the second stage of that transformational learning is actually dealing with a dilemma. There's a dilemma where you get confronted by a new way of seeing the world that's different to your own. And it's a very painful process as a learner to go through, because you have to just dismantle everything that you've built up over a long period of time about how the world works. And we see it here a little bit at the moment. It's really interesting because with the natural gas exploration in agricultural land, we have had farming communities opposed to environmental communities for a very long time. And this issue is really interesting because it's brought those two communities together with a common mandate. And each of those two groups have had to rethink how they think about each other. And that's not an easy process. When you're sworn enemies and you become partners, that's a really interesting process to go through. And admittedly, finding common ground has been quite easy because they've got they're threatened by the same thing in different ways. but the practicalities of working that out on the ground and building those relationships, I'm sure, has been very interesting. It's an emotionally, like us scientists go into science to remove emotions from things, to be observers at a distance, to be objective. And this challenges that approach because you need to bring people and their feelings and their cultural backgrounds and all those things back into the decision-making process. It's not a scientific, objective, black and white way of dealing with the world, and that contravenes a lot of policy making.
Bonnie, the difference between a complex and a complicated, which you didn't talk about, the way I see it is complicated is a process and not a lot of human involvement. You follow certain steps to get to an end point, to get a result. And just for clarification, whereas a complex problem, there's a lot of self-interest involved. I mean, some people may even well know the end result if they keep doing what they're doing, but they don't give a damn because of the last 5 years. So it's really from changing yourself from self-interest point of view to following the science, and the end point is to probably be omnipotent, that is all-seeing and all-knowing. And once you can see it all and know it all, you'll get to the result. And it's and so complex is a lot to do with humans, So have I got all this right? Because I'm giving a
I think in principle that's a pretty good summary, actually. I think an example of a complicated problem is a Boeing. The reason it's complicated is quite clear, because not every man, his dog can go and fix a Boeing. But some of the characteristics of complicated problems is that there is a level of predictability. So you turn this cog and you know you're going to get this amount of response at the other end after 5 cogs. That predictability is very characteristic. So in scientific terminology, we call that a linear response because you can predict it. In complex problems, we have a lot of non-linear responses, and when they cumulatively work together, you get unpredictable responses from that can result. And that's one of the classic differences between complicated and complex. And a lot of the non-linear, unpredictable responses will come from that social element, so having humans involved in, because we're not rational decision makers. Even one of the things that you'll find when you work on complex problems with people is there will be a number of people who come in thinking they are rational decision makers and feeling like they are objective in their decision making. And part of that dismantling of their worldview will be for them to realize that they may think they're objective, but they're not, they're irrational, just like every other human being is. And so that's part of that process of all of us realizing that that is a human weakness and we cannot get around that. The only thing I would say is that I think the objective, I think you're right, the objective is to have all the puzzle pieces eventually. I don't think that can ever happen. I don't think one human being can know every element of reality, and partially that's because of that unpredictability. But also it's very difficult to have the experience of every other person in the room there. And unless you've had that experience, you don't have that depth of understanding that perspective that one person may have. So you can't have complete understanding of them. You can get some of their puzzle pieces, but not all of them. So I don't think we can ever aspire to have the full picture. What we try and do is have enough of a picture to be able to build a hypothesis. And one of the other characteristics of complex problems is that you never know whether the decisions you're making are right or wrong. There is not a black and white way of choosing what approach you take to solving that problem because of the unpredictability. So you may propose a solution, but what you have to do is be ready to change that solution in response to what happens in that unpredictable future. So what it changes the way you think about solving a problem, in that you don't just pick a solution and run with it and then do or die. You have to pick a solution but have an out, or have a point in time where you can adjust management as these unexpected things come up. So it's a very fluid way of managing things, that the conversations and the relationships that you've built up before to define the problem don't just end there. It continues to be a collaboration with everyone playing a part in understanding what's happening in the response, why the response happened like that, how we should adjust our response. So the collaboration continues. And the really awkward thing about complex problems is that you never completely solve them. And that is a really challenging thing for some people to hear. But as soon as you change something, the whole definition of the problem might change. So it's this constant management of a problem as it changes over time. And that's a very different way of thinking about problem solving, because it's not problem solving anymore. It's problem management on an ongoing sense. And you don't actually resolve anything perfectly. Like climate change will never be resolved perfectly, because there will be other things that come up in our management of it over time.
Yeah, your last few lines sound very much like the COVID management. We're learning where we're going and changing and adapting and managing. But my question was basically on this complexity. I've worked in environmental research for 20, 30, 40 years or so. And when I started, basically computers were just coming in, and linear kind of relationships were the easiest way to handle things. Everything was a straight line. You had 2 points, you put a straight line in between, and you had a trend. And then the exponential kind of analysis came in a bit, and our biometricians had multifactorial designs and all that, and things become more complicated. And now, so things have always been complex, but we didn't know how complex they were, but they were complex. And then when we learned more, we didn't have the tools to handle them. And now we got artificial intelligence, and we got many, many millions of aspects and factors that we can put into models. And so it's a matter of learning and getting our tools to help us in assessment of the processes that we're looking at. So the complexity is nothing new. It's just our understanding of the complexity, but it was always complex, but we didn't know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, natural systems are complex systems. What's challenging us is that we're now pushing those natural systems to limits. And those limits are the non-linear part, I suppose, the thresholds or the tipping points that you often hear about. So before that, we haven't had sufficient impact on natural systems to be able to reach the bits where they flip. So we've been dealing very much with the linear straight line sort of relationships that you've been talking about. And it's only now that we're starting to come across that part of the graph, which is the non-linear part, the bit where we tip over. And that's where the modelling has to be a lot more sophisticated. My global ecological footprint modelling has, I think from memory, 8 different dimensions to be able to take account some of the complexity that happens in modelling ecological footprints in a global sense. So it's dealing with, we need to deal with those levels of interrelationships and the fact that straight lines are not straight lines anymore in when we're trying to model relationships out there in the real world. And so it's great because modeling is there to be able to deal with multiple relationships that our brains can't literally keep hold of all at one time. So the modeling is useful to a point, but no matter how sophisticated our modelling is, it can never represent reality. And we have to be very careful with the limits. We have to articulate the limits of our modelling very carefully. And at some point in time, we have to abandon the model to make a decision that moves us forward. And so, yeah, as a modeler, it's very like that's your baby. And to be able to abandon it and just go, okay, now we have to make a decision that's not fully just driven on by this model. We have to take in other evidence as well. That can be challenging, I suppose.
My question is, thanks for explaining how we ask, how we find out how we're wrong, because that's very important to know when we're wrong, and be able to say, okay, well, how went down this track and got the wrong result. How do we cope with people like the anomaly hunter like Craig Kelly that will find the anomalies in the data and say, well, what about this? Do we just ignore them?
Yeah, it's interesting because I did have a really lovely experience doing some research on renewables, and we haven't really got onto that yet, but one of the members on the team was that sort of person. And I had talked to people previous to having him on the team, and they were very derogatory about that experience because having someone like that is super tiring. Someone that continually tests out your thinking all the time. But the researcher that I was working with is Manfred Lenzen from Sydney University, and he worked super constructively with that person. And to be very blunt, the modelling that happened as a result of that was so much stronger than it would have been without him. And so there's a balance, because you have to have emotional maturity to take part in conversations such as those that I've mentioned. And there is a balance between, which we call it, there's different types of thinking. And this comes from a theory of Edward de Bono, who died very recently, but he was absolutely transformative researcher about how we think. And he came up with 6 hats thinking, and I work with my students on this all the time. And the 6 hats have different colors, and they are different types of thinking that are all legitimate at different points in time. And the black hat thinking is the type of thinking you're talking about. Black hat thinking is very critical, finding the flaws in everything, making sure that something's robust by testing the limits of things. And it's a really valid way of thinking. But if that's your only way of thinking, then it's not productive. So to be able to have thinking that is constructive, you have to use all the different types of thinking. And for instance, I'm just trying to think some of the other colors. There's yellow, which I think is about feelings. So actually acknowledging that you have a response to something that's emotional. You have white hat thinking, which I think from memory, don't quote me on all these colors, but there's a type of thinking called, which is the opposite to the black hat, which is really looking at the positives. So to be able to negotiate a problem, you need all of those different types of thinking. So if you allow that person in the group to only do black hat thinking, what you will get is a dynamic in that group that is not going to be able to solve that problem. So that person needs to be challenged to do a range of different types of thinking, or at least input black hat thinking at appropriate times. And that's the role of a facilitator of a group like that. It's balancing out those different types of thinking. And being one way you can do that, if you set up groups like that, is to talk about that right from the outset, to set that context. And then if people know what the different types of thinking are and the value of those different types of thinking, then they can use that language. I'm going to use yellow hat thinking now. I'm going to talk about my feelings and my emotional response to what you just said. And then everyone can just go, okay, we've been very clear about how you're going to approach that response. I'm going to do some black hat thinking now. I'm going to play devil's advocate. But the facilitator then can then at some point say, I think we've done a little bit, we've done enough black hat thinking. Let's balance that out with other types of thinking to make sure that our conversations are robust.
I'm just thinking, Bonnie, in the future, like, should we change our education system, what we do today? We should change it a bit more, because in the future there'll be more complex examination or thinking required, won't there? Because there's going to be more of these sorts of problems coming up. And so if we sort of maybe drop a bit of information learning, because information will be quick, we can get that anytime, but knowing how to sort of communicate properly and critically think properly, all that sort of stuff, I would imagine you would need to require education, change your education. I'll finish there. You know what I'm on
Yeah,
about.
look, Greg, I'm so glad you asked that. And that is literally my passion in life. I feel like that is my purpose. At the moment, we're doing exactly that at the University of Newcastle. So in environmental education, we've been doing that for a very long time because a lot of the theories about complexity came from environmental areas. So environmental people have thought about this more than other disciplines. It is infiltrating into other disciplines too. So there are a lot of research papers investigating complexity in different disciplines. I'm not saying it's in practice in the real world, but what we're attempting to do at the University of Newcastle is transform science education so that we do exactly what you say. We're spending a little bit less time on what information and data and disciplinary learning students have, because they can always look that up. And we're focusing on a third of our degree is now focusing on how students think as scientists and how they work together in teams to actually solve on the ground problems, real problems on the ground, by working in those teams using transdisciplinary methods. And obviously that doesn't happen instantly. It's a very slow incremental process, and it culminates in the third year where every single one of our science students does a project for an industry partner working on in a transdisciplinary team for a whole entire year to solve that problem, with the support to figure out and know how to work in this way. So everything I've been talking to you about today is what we teach our students. We teach them the 6 hats thinking. We teach them how to understand the way their world view works, and how that can be of benefit across different science disciplines in the team. So all of that really sophisticated way of working together, which probably, to be blunt, people don't have in the workforce, is what our graduates are leaving with in the science degree at a fairly basic point. We can't achieve everything in 3 years, but it's an exposure that not many other people have. And I think this is one of the most important things that needs to be done. And I'm actually putting some of my other research on hold because I think this is so important. This is probably the most important thing we need to do as educators at universities, is to have ultimately every student leaving university with this understanding.
Thanks, Bonnie. When you have complex problems, the politicians seem to work from this direction. It keeps people a bit confused. And the only way to solve any issue is to break it down to the smallest possible component and then deal with it from there. Now, but when you're dealing with problems, obviously they're like community issues or something like that, or you're coming up with something new. Do you ever ask yourself, how will it affect the individual? You get problems if people are disaffected. You get a group of people together and you put something to them, and if individuals feel disaffected, they're going to bite back.
Yeah, and that's a classic signal that you've got a complex problem. And one of the things that we teach our students when they're dealing with complex problems is that you do have to take into account differences in power, because you will, in the traditional sort of situation, you will have more powerful stakeholders having more power over the consequences of whatever the decisions are, with inadvertent negative outcomes for other stakeholders who have very little power. And part of having a sophisticated method of dealing with complex problems is that you get both the powerful and the less powerful people together in the room. You may not be able to remove power from that situation, but what you can do as a minimum, if you set up that relationship building sufficiently, is that the powerful people have some exposure to the impact of their decision making on less powerful people. And that's a really important part of managing complex problems, because otherwise you do get exactly what you're talking about. And in the ideal world, the relationships would be so well built that the powerful people would be able to mitigate their decision making to be able to take in the outcomes for less powerful people. In reality, that doesn't always happen, because the mechanisms, you have to be able to remove that as a mechanism, you need to get everyone in the room to have equal decision making power. And that's a pretty brave mandate that you don't often see. So you can address it in varying ways. If you want to really take that seriously, then you need to give people equal decision-making power. And then you have to be very careful about who's in the room to start off with. And that means that things like lobbying will have less impact over time because you've got that agreement from the outset. In practice, that's very difficult to achieve, certainly with politics, because politics works on the basis of power. So you get a lot of alternative political decision-making models that are now emerging. I'm just trying to think of some of their names, like deliberative democracy is one approach, and that actually deals with power very deliberately so that it levels it out a little bit. But it's not common for people in power to take that on because it removes their power. So thereby is the challenge. I think it's the only way you get that type of decision making is that communities can lobby decision makers to demand that type of approach to decision making. And if you've got strong lobbying, you might get a chance of getting that sort of process in place. It's getting more common. You see deliberative democracy occurring a little bit more in councils. So you see often, I've seen some examples of councils using deliberative democracy for people to make decisions on how council money should be spent. And so it is out there as a potential process that communities can use to be able to level off some of that power differences. I'm sure there are other mechanisms too. That's just the one that springs to mind.
Bonnie, earlier on, you mentioned you had some involvement with the Murray-Darling Basin. Are you able to make any comments about that, or what's happened with that?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Rob, because the Murray-Darling Basin was the thing that got me into this type of thinking. I read a really beautiful book called Resilience Thinking, and Brian Walker's name has come up before. So this is before we started our conversation officially. Resilience Thinking was a textbook I used for my students to explain a little bit about complexity thinking. And it's a really lovely book because it's written so clearly. And they had an example of the Goulburn Broken catchment within that. And it was that example that, like, before I'd read a lot of textbooks about complexity or resilience, and I was like, yeah, whatever, don't really get it. That example really clicked for me because it showed me how permanent, if you cross a tipping point, how permanent that can be and why. And therefore, how urgent dealing with these problems is. And I think that example was about groundwater in the Goulburn Broken catchment, how they'd removed the vegetation historically and allowed the groundwater systems to increase in height. And the groundwaters were very close to a tipping point. If they went past a certain height, it would mean permanent removal of all vegetation on the surface of the catchment and the inability to be able to grow the massive amounts of agriculture that are grown there. And once you cross that tipping point, then it's impossible to go back. And that was the thing that really clicked for me. I finally understood how critical this science is, because it's not as if we can go back.
We
Alfred hasn't crossed the tipping point yet.
No, we reversed the tipping point. We got over the tipping point, and basically, you can see this, but we're over the tipping point. We're back here.
Yeah, nice.
John's got a question.
Yeah, now I had another thing about De Bono. I was sad to hear that he just died. He actually came to this part of the world in Shepparton.
Oh.
And he was very expensive, I remember.
I can imagine, John but he probably was worth it.
I think he flew in his own plane, or yeah. But I had a black hat. I'm a black hat thinker.
John's got a question.
Just Bonnie offered to touch on renewable energy and some of the challenges we're facing there, Rob. And I think for the last 5 minutes or so, perhaps give Bonnie open up the subject, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So probably 5 years ago now, I don't know, it's probably been that long, we did some work with Manfred Lenzen from Sydney University, who I'd mentioned before. He's an environmental modeler. He's amazing. And he got a group of people together to model whether it was possible to have 100% renewables in Australia and what that would take and where it should go. And it was, there have been a number of initiatives like that in Australia. So there are a number of research groups who had worked on that previously and since. And our findings were that yes, 100% renewables was possible. It required, the limitation was that we needed storage of energy, and the ability to do that requires us to have a mix of different types of renewables spread across different parts of our very extended geography. And the reason for that is if it's not windy in one place, then it's probably windy somewhere else or sunny somewhere else. So having that geographical spread, having things in different places over large distances is an advantage. Having different types of technologies are also an advantage. So you want to be able to get the right mix. And having technologies that can store or release energy very quickly is also an advantage. And when you've got that right combination, then you can minimize the investment that you need to transition to 100% renewables. Since having done that research, there has been a lot of progress being made, like within even 6 months of us publishing that, there's been a lot of research being made on batteries. So we didn't include that in our modelling because at that time we didn't consider it viable. Within 6 months to 12 months, it was a very real option. There's been a lot of recent talk about hydrogen, which we also didn't include in that because of the infrastructure limitations at the time. The other thing we didn't take into account with that research was offshore wind. And at the time, and currently still, our national policy supporting offshore wind is not conducive to that investment, but that is also changing very rapidly. And since then, Manfred and his students have been doing a lot of additional modelling. And one of the things that they've found is that if you went to 100% electricity generation, renewable electricity generation grid, that would require significant investment in new technology. But if you also wanted electric vehicles, you would think that you just add the amount of electricity that you get from your vehicles onto the normal household electricity or manufacturing demand. But what it actually means is electric cars can store some of the electricity from the grid. And then because we've got this storage, they can work together so we don't need as much investment in new renewable infrastructure. So there's been a lot of change since we published that research. But the key thing is that hasn't changed is we need technologies that can store energies, and we're getting a lot of investment in those sorts of things now. So that's a really positive thing. What we're not getting is the coordinated and very strategic planning on where technology should go. That is a real problem because you're getting a lot of private sector investment in renewables, but they're just popping the locations of these renewables next to existing grids. And the existing grid is not necessarily in the best location for a completely different type of energy system. And what we're getting is a lack of strategic planning at the government level. We're also getting a lack of investment in the actual grid and how it needs to change. And there's the big dilemmas. That's not something that every man on the ground can do something about, but we can lobby. And that's, I suppose, that space where we can influence change is through collective voice, collective action to lobby for those types of changes. And you don't see very much in the media about that.
Did you factor in weather effects in your research like they've just had in Melbourne around the Dandenongs?
Yeah, so we used 10 years of prior actual weather data at, I think, half-hour intervals. I can't quite remember. So we actually didn't model into the future. We just used past data so that our findings could be like a little bit less controversial. So it would have factored in variability across the country in that sort of way.
It's 12 o'clock, folks, so we should in theory wrap up. So, and I should mention though that next month we've got Violet Coco, who's from Extinction Rebellion in Melbourne, and she was going to talk about Extinction Rebellion, the fact that she was in jail in Canberra for 7 days. So that should be pretty good with Violet Coco. So anyway, thank you very much, Bonnie. That has been wonderful. So I think if Lou's still waving on that, people are waving. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me, everyone. It was really lovely.
I appreciate you coming. Thanks, Bonnie.
Bye,
and thanks
everyone.
all you guys for turning up. It was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.